Welcome to another edition of Chicago Crossing Model Railroad Train Talk. It's me, Eric, here with you. Where am I? God. Welcome to another edition of Chicago Crossing Model Railroad Train Talk. It's me, Eric, here with you down in the train room as always. And today we are throwing out model railroading and we're going to be highway engineers. Well, maybe not literally, you and I can keep our day jobs, but nonetheless, we're going to think like highway engineers as we think about strategies for wiring small model railroad layouts. Because really it's all about efficiency. It's about the economical movement of electrons or people in cars from one area to another area in the fewest number of moves and in the most efficient way. So how do you do that? Well, in some ways it's actually like a game. You know, this is a point in which pencil and paper become really useful because you can draw out in advance where your wiring will actually need to go and how it can get there in a way where you can bundle it and trunk it and keep it together and at the same time keep it separate from other conflicting uses that might need their own repairs down the road. A mindful approach to this sort of strategy can mean that your layout will remain electronically stable and enjoyable for as long as you have it. You know, take it from me, nothing is more visually confusing than wires just running everywhere with no idea as to what they are, where they came from, or where they're going. It makes all of the other aspects of dealing with your model railroad when it comes to maintenance, expansion, troubleshooting, etc., really, really difficult. So it's not something you want to do. You know, if you've ever gone to a large industrial building, or if you've looked at an office building through the drop ceiling, or if you've looked at, say, the interior of an engine room of a ship or a battleship or something like that, then you probably notice that just about all of the pipe work and electrical work in there is not only fastidiously labeled, but it's also color-coded so that one can tell at a glance what something is in order to know whether that is the object of a fault or in something that is in need of repair. Using that same approach to the wiring of your layout is a really good way to make sure that down the road you and anybody else will have easy visual access to what all of the different things on your layout are, to understand where they're going and where they come from, and to be able to service them in a really easy way. So I've mentioned before, all of the wires underneath my layout are color-coded based on what they are. And wiring for DCC and all of the different accessory buses are all color-coded and then also labeled. So there's always a cross-reference between those so that you know exactly what you need to work with if I'm going to, say, patch in another terminal for something else off of one of those buses. It's easily visually identifiable, and there's a label for everything. This also fits as well with all of the different terminals. Their voltages and their uses are also labeled right next to them. And in this case, really, one of the best tools that you can have for working on the underside of a layout as you're building it and as you're building in all of the electronics and utilities is a label maker. I would strongly recommend that you either have one, borrow one, whatever. They're relatively affordable, especially if you're building a model railroad. It's worth having or borrowing from somebody else in order to make sure that everything on your layout is labeled and that you will know what it is years down the road. Or if you ever decide to sell it, give it away, do whatever, whoever inherits it from you also has that same advantage of being able to know everything that happens to go on underneath the layout visually and at a glance. The other aspect of wiring organization is a term that is known as wire dressing. And it sounds like a rather strange term, but basically what this refers to is how wires are organized, how they are trunked and bundled together, and how they flow from their origins to their destinations. This is where I found that the feedback and advice of viewers of my channel who happen to be plumbers or electricians or tradesfolks or engineers of any sort has actually been really, really helpful for me to best identify strategies to help maintain and dress the wires that I have into something that seems like a logical flow. And so there's a few different principles that my viewers have offered me and that I used as a result in how I worked with the wiring on my layout. So first off, organize and bundle wires together that have like uses, and avoid bundling wires with different uses together. Think about it this way. If I have streetlight wires running into the same set of clips or same bundle zip tied together as I have, say, DCC feeders, then if I need to repair one, I'm basically having to loosen and rebundle both. And so being able to make sure that all uses are segregated into their own bundles and into their own trunks ensures that if you ever have to service, expand, or maintain any specific set, you don't have to disrupt the way that the other wires are all put together. It just keeps things very, very straightforward and makes sure that you make the minimum amount of mess if you ever need to go underneath and make a modification again. Number two, and this kind of comes from maybe more of a circuitry background, but use right angles or at least, reasonable angles when you're moving wires, but avoid, and this is actually very important, avoid kinking wires into like hard right angles and things like that. That actually risks kinking them, damaging them, or subjecting them to stress that eventually may lead the wiring to actually degrade. So all of the wiring on Chicago Crossing I kind of treat more like plumbing in the sense that it forms an elbow rather than forming an angle. And that difference is actually meaningful. It may be a sort of 90-degree angle one way or the other, but an elbow curves. It doesn't kink as a right angle truly does. Next up is to move wires into trunks wherever possible in order to feed into terminals. And so the way I think about this is basically, how do I get all the wires from the different random locations in a section to essentially flow into one large finalized trunk that then moves into, say, a terminal for streetlight LEDs or something like that. Sometimes the easiest way to think this out is actually to draw it out and come up with a plan for how you would like those wires to go before you actually begin the wiring process itself. That helps you get a little bit better of a sense of how much wiring you'll actually need. You can even, if you want, say, take measurements or things like that. I didn't really do that. I just sort of, checked it by scrolling out the wire and seeing how much I might need. But nonetheless, it can help you plan things to just be able to get wire from one place to another with the minimum set of moves, and to try to keep everything together in one visually accessible area. Number 4, use durable, high-quality solutions for wire splices and joints. I can't emphasize that enough, because you only want to do this once and you don't want to have to do it again. You know, it can be tempting to take a couple of wires together and to basically twist them and say, hey, great, I'm done. That's an unstable mechanical connection that at some point through the vagaries of time, temperature changes, humidity changes, and the like, is probably just going to become undone, and then you're going to end up having to chase a fault down in one of your circuits or something like that. And so for me, I basically went with time-tested solutions that other model railroaders have found to work well for them. I didn't really try to be all that innovative, but I also did try to be systematic with how I used specific things. So as an example, the solution for creating drop wires from my different buses down to the different terminals was simply to use old-fashioned suitcase connectors, where you use a pair of pliers and you clamp down on a common metal conductor that now creates essentially a stable splice joint between two different wires, and then has a lot of plastic shell around it that helps to protect that splice. That was a simple, fast way of doing things that I've seen folks ranging from Larry Puckett to almost everybody else use within the model railroading community. And it's served me well, and it's created stable connections that offer minimal resistance or anything like that. In addition, for components that may at some point or another need to be swapped out or repaired, I don't anticipate these, but nonetheless, for me, this just makes me comfortable. Things like switches or the bulkhead connectors that are mounted into the side of one of the rafters of Chicago Crossing, I use Wago wire nuts. You know, these are very, very strong wire clamps that offer a stable and a highly protected joint that is reversible. And for me, that seems like a good use for those particular tools. Now, of course, that adds a lot of bulk because these are sort of long rectangles, and relative to the relatively thin wires, yeah, they create a lot of bulk. So I only used them within those locations. And elsewise, for just about every other wire joint, it's good old-fashioned soldering, because few things are as stable as molten metal creating a solid metal-on-metal connection between two wires. And I'll tell you that probably about 400 soldering joints later, I've certainly gotten better at soldering. It took longer, but again, those are stable connections that will withstand the test of time. In addition to simply using a soldering iron and solder in order to make sure that those connections were solid, it's really important to make sure that those connections are also protected. And so that means every solder joint also has a heat shrink wrap over it in order to make sure that the insulated component of the wiring is retained and that that joint is protected. Lastly, there are some joints that may seem stable, but probably are a good idea to also solder. A great example for that are the spade connectors that I use for the DCC terminal blocks on the end of the feeder wires. Those are the result of using a mechanical crimper in order to crimp down the metal in the spade connector on top of the wire. However, those are also somewhat notorious over time for loosening or potentially coming off. And so each one of those spade connectors, and any spade connector on my layout, also is soldered together so that that withstands the test of time. Number 5 is the liberal use of wire clips and standoffs all throughout the layout. This was something that I remember somebody who is a professional fitter mentioned, and they do this in their work in houses as well. And it makes the same rationale true for a layout. One of the biggest sources of damage to wiring or any sort of mechanical joint is movement. If something is unstable and it moves around, then it's liable to be damaged during handling or the like. You know, one can imagine going underneath a layout where all the wires are sort of ballooning down underneath, and it just takes a moment in order to snag a tool, one's hand, one's finger, or one's head, or God knows what, onto a wire, and to pull it loose and rip it from where it was. That's now an unnecessary repair that you've got to take on in addition to whatever it was that you were doing before. Likewise, if you happen to move your layout around and you snag wires on something, once again, you create a risk of creating more repairs for yourself than you necessarily intend to have. So it really doesn't take much time when you're thinking about how best to dress your wires and keep them in place to have a lot of wire clips of different sizes around so that you can affix your wires to the underside or side of the layout and make sure that, number one, they stay in place, particularly if you're working hard to try to get them to trunk together. And number two, so that they are protected from randomly moving around. As a last note, in addition to wire clamps, having little wire ties, they sort of look like small zip ties, used liberally throughout will also help you to keep your wires organized and keep them stable and keep them from shifting around. It's usually not enough just to have clamps. The main thing, as with wiring elbows, is don't over tighten them to the point where you could potentially be crushing your wires together. But do tighten them to the point where you're not necessarily going to have those wire ties moving around the entire length of the wire in between clamps. Last up, think in 3 dimensions as you're working in wiring. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy because you're probably saying, well, shoot, man, it's already tough enough to think how to do wiring in 2 dimensions. How am I going to get to 3? Well, think of it this way. What you want to avoid when you're doing a model railroad is what is essentially an archaeological dig of different layers of wiring or circuits or things like that. So in my case, for instance, the main power buses actually run through the center line of the horizontal beams of the layout. What that means is that they are actually physically detached from the surface of the layout except for some wire standoffs that I used in order to help, once again, keep them stable. What this means, though, is that I've saved all of that real estate for all of the other feeder wires underneath to be fastened to the surface, and at the same time have created essentially, airspace or air rights for some of the other wiring trunks that I need in order to be able to work with the layout. So in that sense, it keeps you from having to layer upon layer upon layer all sorts of different wiring objects on top of each other, which makes a real headache when it comes to trying to undo things for any kind of expansion or maintenance that you have to do. Instead, it lets you use some of the vertical component, even of a small layout, to your advantage in order to keep things from having to cross directly on top of each other. That can be really, really helpful when it comes to being able to maintain, expand, and work with your layout wiring. After 2 different iterations of lifting up this layout in order to redo wiring, Zen of wiring aside, I'm kind of over that. I don't want to do that again. So with the wiring in good stead at this point, you might say, when would you ever have to do that? Well, if I don't build expandability into that wiring system, then yeah, next thing you know, I will be underneath there having to redo or add a whole bunch of new stuff that isn't already there. None of us can predict the future of our layouts. None of us know precisely what new technologies or new cool gadgets or things like that might be out in the world. But if there's one thing that we know, it's that they will probably require electricity, and that dealing with some of that stuff now is not the worst thing in the world. So with that in mind, I used a few different strategies to try to make sure that Chicago Crossing remains expandable and requires a minimal amount of underneath the layout work going forward. So item 1 is I built in far more capacity for the things I already have than I necessarily need at this time. And that includes terminals for LEDs, that includes terminals for DCC feeders in certain locations where I know that I will expand the layout. It includes wires for buses and truncating them at points where I know that I can continue to expand them in order to move, say, out this way for a side of the layout if I want to expand in that direction. So all of that sort of stuff is actually really important. Making sure you have a little bit more than you need is actually a really good idea. The unswitched bus that I have is also really kind of a key element for facilitating expandability on the layout. There's a reason that I decided to run that as a 12-volt bus, and that is because 12 volts really is a nominal voltage for a lot of different accessories that are used by model railroads, often plus or minus just a few volts in one direction or the other. In addition, a lot of different accessories like Arduino boards happen to have onboard voltage regulators that can accept a wide variety of voltages in order to power them. So once again, you don't have to know the future. You don't have to know how many Arduino boards you're actually going to mount on the underside of your layout in order to power specific accessories and to animate them and things like that. On the other hand, though, considering that you probably will at some point do that, will help you to plan out how best you use the space on the underside of the layout, how best you organize your wiring, and identify what sorts of voltages or bus structures work best for you. So lastly, some final thoughts about wiring model railroads. Number one is, I don't have all the answers, and you may find specific strategies and specific things that actually work really well for you. My layout is an example of one of many different right answers to how to approach the question of how do I get electricity from point A to point B in a reliable and functional way on a model train layout. You'll find all sorts of different people have different answers and different solutions, some of which may work better for you. Really what it comes down to is basically a habit of mind issue, which is think first and plan first, and then do what you think is best and experiment a bit too. A lot of what I learned while doing this process actually just comes from, experimentation, seeing what is possible and not worrying so much about whether or not it is the optimal option, but just, does it work? Is it right for me? Can I justify it in one way or another? So yeah, you don't need to have a server power rack. You don't have to have a computer power supply. You don't have to have multiple voltage buses. You can have what you want in order to best make sure that your layout is enjoyable and stable for years and years to come, so that you don't have to do the same things that I did, like, a couple times over. So just keep in mind, considering upfront what your layout's needs are, considering upfront what they might be in the future, is a great way to make sure that when you actually start the process of putting all the electrical work together underneath there, that you do it in a way that helps to make your layout enjoyable for years to come. All right, we'll leave it at that. Hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Talk to you soon.